Thank you very much, Sean. And I think just to add on the last point that you made, I mean, we're all sex workers in some form or another. You know, just because if you're not standing on Nugget Street or you're not, an escort, but in terms of, transactional sex, most of us have done it here, you know? Exactly. And sex is, if it's consensual, a very pleasurable act. And so then we found that we're in a situation where we've taken a pleasurable act and we've criminalized it simply because it's an exchange of services and now I take money for it. At that point, it becomes criminalized. So what I'm going to touch on today is our road to decriminalization. It's been a very long road, looking at almost 30 years worth of work. And yes, Sisonke National Movement is now, we are our own NPO, and we have kind of technically divorced from Sweat, but we definitely do work very closely with them. We are comrades in the struggle. Okay. All right, so just to talk on the current law in South Africa. So in South Africa, sex work was criminalized under the Immorality Act, or this was in 1957. And then it changed to the Sexual Offences Act of 1957. Now, this act was amended in 2007, but the sections that criminalize sex work still remain in that act. And so the act, the law, it criminalizes the buying of sex, selling the service, living off the proceeds of sex work. And I think I do want to emphasize that because essentially my family or the children that I support through sex work are criminals under South African law. That's how it is. And so, but what we see in terms of the implementation of criminalization with sex workers, we see it through the municipal bylaws. And so that's where now we look at the intersectionality of it. And I do just want to touch a bit on when we think about, our key populations and strategizing on how we can, address the health, socioeconomic issues, we have to think about it in an intersectional way. Because my experiences, depending on my gender, my race, my class, my my gender identity, my sexual orientation, all of that is going to feed into my experience in the world. And so when we try to think about, well, how do we address these issues, we have to consider all of those things. It's not going to be a blanket approach. And it is going to have to involve uncomfortable conversations. We have to talk about race. We can't avoid it. We have to talk about class, as uncomfortable as it is. But in order to get sustainable or impactful solutions, we have to consider all of those parts that make you a person in this world. So back to the point on municipal bylaws, this mostly, if not only, affects street-based sex workers. And so if we look at the different types of sex work, street-based sex workers are the most oppressed. They are the most, they are the group of sex workers that are exposed to the most violence. And so municipal bylaws, so we're talking about loitering, solicitation, and we don't just see that here in South Africa, all countries really that criminalize sex work. When you look at implementation, it comes through in the municipal bylaws. And so, I mean, our question here is that if we look at the 1957 Act, which criminalized sex work, interracial relationships, and same-sex relationships, once we moved into a democratic South Africa, same-sex and interracial relationships, they were decriminalized. But why is it that adult consensual sex work can still remain in a democratic South Africa, and that it can still remain under this beautifully written constitution that is supposed to inform all other laws in the country? Why is that still the case? And so that's really the basis of our advocacy for decriminalization. All right, so we have 4 legal models on sex work. I could make a whole workshop on that, but I will be brief. And I think I do just want to highlight that so that we can see the differences with these 4 legal models. So the first one is where we are now, which is full criminalization. So this is where all aspects in the sex work industry are criminalized, the seller, the buyer, brothel keeper, living off the proceeds. So that's where we are right now. Then the next one is partial criminalization. So this is also known as the Nordic model or the Swedish model. Now, under this model, buying sex, yes, is criminalized, but selling sex is not. So the client is criminalized in this system. Now, the thinking behind it was that, okay, so if we're saying that sex workers are the ones that are more exposed to violence from law enforcement, from clients also, let's decriminalize them and that'll make the industry safer. That was their thinking. Now, obviously, with the research that's been done, especially from NGOs and sex work-led organizations, that's not the case. Sex workers are still exposed to violence, to stigma and discrimination. And so this legal model, it doesn't make sex workers' lives easier in any way. Then the next one here is legalization. Now, the thing is, for this one, we have to remember that legalization of sex work and full decriminalization of sex work are not the same thing. The terms are used interchangeably, but there are key differences there. So, under legalization, the buying and selling of sex is legal, but it's under very strict laws and regulations. So, I like to use the example of Senegal. So in Senegal, sex work is legalized. And one of the regulations that they have is that they say that all sex workers need to carry a card that allows them to work legally. And in order to have that card, you need to go for regular HIV testing. So this is a regulation that's only targeted at sex workers. The other citizens aren't required to walk around with what is essentially itompas, if we're going to be honest. And so, again, the thinking behind that with the policymakers was that, well, this is going to encourage more sex workers to get tested, and so that's going to decrease infections. But again, if you do the research, if you go to sex work-led organizations on the ground, that's not the case. The HIV infections have not decreased. We still have stigma and discrimination in healthcare facilities. Now, if I, as a sex worker, have to go to a clinic, and I go to that clinic, and I'm already shamed in the clinic by the nurses and being called umahosha, you're selling your bodies, you're immoral, am I going to go back to that facility? I'm not. And so having all of these regulations, it still doesn't address the stigma and discrimination that sex workers face. So then you'll find that a lot of sex workers are still going to be working because it's our job, but now we are still working as criminals if we are not following the strict regulations, targeted regulations that are put in place. Another example is the red light district. So I mean, this is a huge tourist attraction. Everybody, you want to go to Amsterdam, you want to go to the red light district. And so from the outside perspective, you think, okay, well, here is a place where sex workers can work. Surely this is great for sex workers. But the thing we have to remember is that now sex workers are limited to work in one space. And in the nature of sex work, you go to where the clients are. You can't expect all of the clients to come meet me in this particular street. If I have clients that live in a different town, I should be able to go there and to do my business. So again, you see these regulations that are specifically targeted at sex workers, and in the implementation is still used unfairly against sex workers. And it still contributes to stigma and discrimination. So then we get to the one that we love, full decriminalization. So full decriminalization, it's the only human rights-based and inclusive approach to sex work. So inclusivity here is a very, very important one, because what we're saying is that we want to be included in the existing laws of the country. Because for the arguments about human trafficking, there is an act that addresses human trafficking. If sex work is decriminalized, it doesn't mean that that act is going to fall away. Same thing with the Children's Act. We have the Children's Act there. If sex work is decriminalized, it doesn't mean that now we're going to allow minors who are under 18 to enter the industry. And I do have to add that there are under 18s that enter the industry. And sex workers have identified those places where children are being exploited. But out of fear of being arrested, if I can identify that there are children that are being exploited, how do I then go to the police and report this without stating that I'm a sex worker and risk me being arrested myself? So you see how there's so many opportunities for us to really tackle huge social issues, but it has to be inclusive. Sex workers need to be included in that. So yes, so this is what we really are pushing for full decriminalization. So looking at the milestones that Sisonke and I'll say the sex work sector as well has achieved. So this is the timeline of the successes that we've had. I'm not going to go through all of them, but I do want to highlight that we have support from COSATU, the biggest trade union, that is also supporting decriminalization of sex work. They had sent a submission to the Law Reform Commission in support of decriminalization. We also have had support from the ruling party where they have, if I say support, they have put it as a resolution. Decriminalization is put as a resolution. But now we're saying that in the conference that you did, you have supported and endorsed the resolution for decrim, but you're the ruling party. Why are we not seeing decriminalization? Why are we not seeing it being prioritized there? So then it becomes, is it all talk and no action? Are you then coming out publicly and saying that we support decriminalization because it makes you look good? But what actually happens with actually putting in the work in order to achieve it? Yes, so these are just some of the other highlights. And so in 2016, there was the first launch of the National Sex Work HIV, TB, and STI Plan. This was very, very successful. So we have a policy that is endorsed by the government and through civil society and SANEC, where decriminalization is mentioned multiple times in that plan, that decriminalization is a very important aspect in addressing the health issues within the sex work industry. So again, we have it there in policy, it's written down. But why is it that decriminalization has been there's such a pushback from the government, which I'll get into in a moment. But you see, it's in this National Sex Work HIV, the plan. It's also included in the Gender-Based Violence and Femicide Plan that was recently launched. So the government is saying, yes, we understand that decriminalization is important in order to address gender-based violence and femicide. So it's there. They know about it. They know how important it is. But why is it not being prioritized? And so then we get to 2022. So this is really where the journey of the decrim bill started. So through the support of the Department of Justice, who did a series of consultations in the provinces, speaking to sex workers and also those that were anti-sex workers, just to get a sense of what are the communities saying. So this was a really good chance for sex workers themselves to give input in terms of what do we want in this bill? What does decriminalization look like for us? So before I get into this, so the bill, it's a pretty simple bill. It has three main asks. It says that you must repeal the section in the 1957 Act that criminalizes sex work. repeal the section in the 2007 Amendment Act that criminalizes sex work, and then also remove anybody with criminal records under the National Act. So we still haven't addressed the issue of municipal bylaws. And the thing is that with this decrim process, there's always the question of, but what about the bylaw? What about the regulations? What about the regulations? And what we're saying is that you can't regulate a criminalized industry. There's no way that you can come up with effective regulations if we are still criminalized. So here is just an overview of the law reform process. So where we are right now, I can't use the laser. Okay, anyway. All right, so we are at stage 6, where the bill is considered by cabinet. So we are still in the process here, and if it is approved, then it'll be sent into parliament yet. So in these processes, from about step 1 to about step 6, we've also had certification from the socioeconomic impact assessment study. And there was also the process where, so just to take it back a bit. So 2022, the Department of Justice called for submissions for the decrim bill. And the deadline for that was the 31st of January 2023. So as soon as this came out, and it came out in around December, then it was a challenge of, we need to get as many submissions as possible before meeting the deadline. And so the submissions, they were sent through. There were some challenges with that, which I'm going to get into. And so after receiving all of those submissions, the DOJ looked at the submissions, and then they also got a legal opinion from the state law advisor. So the state law advisor looked at the bill and said that it does not meet constitutional muster. Yes. So the state law advisor's opinion, it stated that the bill doesn't meet or pass constitutional muster because it doesn't include a framework for regulations. So now we can see that the fact that we haven't included regulations in the bill, now it seems like it's not constitutional. But again, our argument is saying, how do we discuss regulations if you have not given us that first initial yes? We need to get that foot in the door before we can have an effective conversation about regulations. And even when we do get to that conversation about regulations, it has to be led by sex workers. We want to avoid a situation where we have government officials and policymakers that have no idea about the sex work industry, trying to make regulations on the industry, because then you'll find a case where it's possible that the government will move towards legalization. And as we've already seen, and research has already showed, that legalization, the research shows that it doesn't have a positive effect for sex workers' lives. And so that was the state law advisor. Now, there was a short time frame for getting the submissions by the 31st of January, because we could only send our submissions either via email or by post. Now, we already know the post office system in South Africa. And so then it's like, okay, well, sending it by mail or by post may not be the best idea, so we have to go through emails. Now, even with that, they would not count submissions, multiple submissions coming from one email address. So it had to come from individual email addresses. So when we then went into provinces and we had the consultations with our members, a lot of them we found didn't even have email addresses. So then we had to go and help them to create these email addresses. So you can already see that with all of those conditions, it leaves out people that don't have access to email addresses. So it's only the privileged people that can access or they are able to have a voice in this law reform process, and there are so many people that are left behind. So that was one of those big challenges. And so what we want is that we want to get to the second round of submissions, which would be when the bill goes into Parliament. Then there'll be a second round of submissions, and this is really now, we've learned our lessons from the first round of submissions. So now we want to use those lessons into the second round of submissions, but we need to get that opportunity. And so we want to push to go past stage 6. That's what we're really pushing for now. Now, in terms of let me go back. Right. So, after stage 6, which is the introduction of the bill into Parliament, and then we would go to stage 8, which is tagging. So, tagging means that they have to basically categorize the bill. So that hasn't happened yet, but it is most likely that we are going to be categorized as a Section 76 bill. Now, what that means is that this is a bill that will also affect provinces. So, if it's a Section 76 bill, then if the bill passes the National Assembly, it still has to go to the National Council of Provinces if it is categorized as a Section 76. Now, this is where our provincial legislatures come in. So, going back into some of the work that we've done, the KZN legislature endorsed resolutions. They hosted a sex work symposium, and the first symposium where the legislature endorsed the resolution that sex work should be decriminalized. And really what we want is we want other provincial legislatures to look at what KZN has done, because they did a really powerful thing with the symposium where they invited sex workers and government officials and all other key stakeholders. And sex workers, we had the opportunity to speak to these people and to really talk about what is happening in my life. How does criminalization affect my life? And it was so powerful because it's one thing to get this information, from a researcher or, somebody with that kind of position. And I'm not even... I'm not saying that the work that they're doing is not important. It's definitely important. But for us, Sisonke, as a movement, we want to empower sex workers to take the lead in advocating for decriminalization, because ultimately decriminalization will affect their everyday lives. So if we get to stage 8, then we would be a Section 76. Then, if the bill it passes the National Assembly, it would go to the National Council of Provinces, and even after that, we have to bring the municipalities into the conversation. So this is where we have to talk to the councillors. And so in all of our lobbying efforts, all of these people are our targets. So how do we access the other provincial legislatures? How do we access the councillors and the mayors? Because then once the bill is passed at a national level, we also need to get those players to be on our side in order to see a positive implementation of this act. Okay, so these are the challenges. Right, so another thing that I do want to add is that in this whole process, we have realized that the government and departments of justice and the state law advisor and all of the instrumental people in this process, they still are working with their own biases. They don't leave it at the door. And so that's when you'll find that all of those personal biases come into how they interpret decriminalization of sex work. And it's unfortunate because then you'll find that they will use their own procedures and processes to suppress this bill. And so then our big job is, how do we then sensitize them? How do we get them to really understand what sex work is, and to give them the correct information so that they can make an informed decision? It's a challenge because even getting invited into those spaces is difficult. And even when you get a seat at that table, am I able to speak at that table? Because it doesn't help that I'm sitting at this table and I'm silent. I need to have a voice at that table. So how do we do that? That's also been something that's been quite difficult for us. So some of the things that we have done, we recently marched to the to the National Department of Justice offices in Pretoria, and we handed over a memorandum to the minister. So we marched in the streets of Pretoria. Here you see, yes, so here's our director, Ms. Kholi Buthelezi, who was at the front lines, and here she was reading the memorandum, and it was also signed by Steve Letseke, the chairperson of the Civil Society Forum. And we, in that memorandum, Minister Lamola was supposed to respond within 5 working days. He has not responded. Crickets. Which isn't really surprising, but that's the thing, is that we know that he hasn't responded, but we have to keep the pressure going. Because it's the Department of Justice that initially introduced the bill into Parliament. And so we still need their support to prioritize this bill. And so we have issued another letter to Lamola, and we're saying that we need to prioritize this bill before next year's elections. Because if this bill does not pass before 2024, the 30 years of work that we have done, we have to start from scratch. And that means another 30 years. And within those 30 years, how many more sex workers are going to get killed? How many more are going to be raped? So this, it's a matter of urgency. Our lives are at stake here. And so we need the Department of Justice and other departments, because to address issues, intersectional issues, it needs a multi-sectoral response. There's no way that the Department of Justice alone, or the Department of Health alone, or social development alone will address these issues effectively. They have to, I mean, if I can use the term, an orgy. They have to get into an orgy, really, in order to come up with these decisions, you know, and to come up with these solutions. So those are some of the things that we've also been doing, and it has to be a continuous thing. I think as you know, everybody knows here, if you're an activist, you know that the work will always continue, as tiring as it is, but we have to keep going. And so our next steps is to put pressure on the Department of Justice, because they're the ones within cabinet that should really be pushing for the bill to be prioritized before the 2024 elections. We are also prioritizing education on the 4 legal models, because what we found is that government has been looking at what other countries have been doing. And our fear is that they're going to be leaning towards the Swedish model and not full decriminalization, which isn't going to, it isn't going to give us the solution that we want. We do want to also register with the National Economic Development and Labour Council, or NEDLAC, and so we think that we are saying that sex workers work, and so we want it to be recognized in an official space. And of course, we want to strengthen, you know, our support from the region. If we have SADC also talking about decriminalization, or the African Union and UN bodies, I think that if we have pressure from the global spaces on the South African governments to say, what are you doing about this? Then this will also give them the pressure to prioritize our bill. Okay, and then I just some closing remarks. I do think that in terms of people who use drugs, needs to be included in the Civil Society Forum. A lot of our achievements were through that inclusion in the civil society space. And so when we talk about law reform for people who use drugs, that is a seat that we need. We need to get included at that table in an effective way. And so law reform isn't effective if we are still living in a criminalized system. So the policies are there. It says that we need to decriminalize. Let's see the action behind it. And we continue to call for the government to give us the first yes. Give us the first yes. Thank you very much.